we need to talk about James. Which James? All of them. Okay, let me turn this around. It seems a little bit complicated with all the names and numbers, but we'll go through it. So in 1406, James Stuart became James I, King of Scots. Now, he was assassinated, but it was okay because he had a son, and he was called James, and he became James II. He was a nasty piece of work. He was killed, he was only a young man. He was standing next to a cannon that exploded, took out his femur, and he bled to death. But it was okay because he had a son, and he became James III. And James III was killed at the Battle of Socky but it was okay. Well, it wasn't okay because his son was probably had something to do with it. His son became James IV. Now, James IV was having a bit of a fight with the armies of Henry VIII down in England, and he lost. He was killed at the Battle of Flodden, but it was okay because he had a son, and he was called James V. James V did have a son, and funnily enough, he called him James, but sadly he died when he was only 1 year old, as did his brother Robert. So they never became king, but his daughter, Mary, became Mary Queen of Scots. Now, she wasn't allowed to be queen for very long because she wasn't called James. That was a joke, by the way. But she did have a son, and guess what? He was called James, so he became James VI. Now, down in England, Elizabeth I, let's put her there, she died in 1603, but she didn't have an heir. So, let's bring it over here. So, James became the first King James of England, James I. It was the same person. James VI of Scotland and James I of England were the same person. Now, he had a son, and annoyingly, he called him Charles. He did have an older brother who died, and Charles became king. And he had a son, and he was also called Charles, so he was Charles II. Now, Charles II didn't have any legitimate children, so his brother took over, and his brother was called James. Now, James was therefore the second James of England, but he would also have been James VII of Scotland. Now, James VII of Scotland, we don't really call him that much. It's just James II of England we know him as. He did have a son, and he was called, guess what? James. Now, he would have been the third James of England had he been king, and he would have been the 8th James of Scotland. But he wasn't. There was a rebellion. They raised a standard to James VIII of Scotland and James III of England in Scotland, but the rebellion was put down. And he had a son, and he was called Charles. James III is who we know as the Old Pretender, because he was never on the throne. And Charles, his son, we know as Bonnie Prince Charlie. Pen at the ready, we're going to map out the Henrys. To make it easier to remember all the Henrys, I like to separate them out into the first 3, the next 3, and then the last 2. I think that's slightly easier. But we have to go all the way back to 1066, when William the Conqueror becomes William I of England. And he has a son, and his name's William, and he's William Rufus. Doesn't have an heir when he's killed in an accident in the New Forest. But his brother Henry takes over the job, and he becomes our first Henry, Henry I. Now, Henry had a son, but he was killed in the White Ship disaster, and his only legitimate heir when he died was Matilda. But, well, Matilda was a woman, and she didn't get the throne. It went instead to her cousin Stephen. Now, they fought like mad during the anarchy, the Civil War. It was a horrendous time. But then it was decided that Stephen, when he died, would hand the crown over to Matilda's son, and he was our second Henry, Henry II. Henry had a son who was Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, but he didn't have any heir, so it was passed on to John, Bad King John. Bad King John had a son, and he was called Henry, and he's our third Henry. So there's our first 3. We'll do a time check there. 1216 was when Henry came to the throne. Okay, there weren't many Henrys for a while. We had 3 Edwards. I'm going to run out of time if I write them all out. 3 Edwards and a Richard. Now, Richard was usurped by a chap called Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV. He was, via John of Gaunt, a descendant of Edward III. Now, he had a son, and his name was Henry. He was Henry V, our warrior at Agincourt. And he had a son, and he was Henry VI, not quite so warrior-like. This is the time of the War of the Roses. Up here was 1399. So this is all the War of the Roses stuff. And he was usurped by a chap called Edward. Now, Edward was also a descendant of Edward III through the York line, and he became Edward IV. He had a son. He was Edward V, but he was one of the princes in the Tower. He disappeared, and Edward's brother Richard III. Edward's brother Richard became Richard. Oh, hang on, we've gone off camera. Richard III. And Richard III had a big fight with Henry Tudor, and Henry got the throne, and Henry became Henry VII, and he had a son, and he became Henry VIII. So there you go, 7 and 8. Okay, pen at the ready. Time for the Georges. I'll make a different video, a separate one, about how the Hanoverians came to the throne, because it involves the Stuarts and there's a little bit more to it. But this one's just about the Georges. So we start with George I, who came to the throne in 1714 when Anne died. Now, George was off visiting Hanover one day. He was on his way there when he had a stroke and he died. But it was okay because he had a son and heir, and he was called George, and he became George II. And George II had a son, and guess what he was called? Yeah, he wasn't called George, he was called Frederick. And Frederick wasn't allowed to come to the throne because he wasn't called George. That was a joke, by the way. He died, he was hit in the chest by a tennis ball, they were harder then, or a cricket ball, and he died of complications of that. But it was okay because he had a son, and he was called George, and he came to the throne as George III. That's why George III had such a long reign, because he came as a young man, his father having not been on the throne. George III had a son, and guess what he was called? Yeah, he was called George, and he was George IV. He was Prince Regent for a while when his dad went mad, but he came to the throne and had 10 years in his own right. Now, George IV had a daughter called Charlotte, but Charlotte sadly, it was sad. She had died in childbirth, and the boy didn't survive either. So there was no heir from George IV, and so the throne went to his brother, and his brother was called William. Now, William had been around the world a bit, sailing. He didn't come to the throne until he was in his 60s, and he didn't have any children, any legitimate children. So where were they going to go next? Well, there was this big scrabble among the family to try and provide an heir, but there was one. They also had another brother who had been called Edward, the Duke of Kent, but Edward had died not before having a daughter, and she was called Alexandrina. Alexandrina came to the throne as Queen Victoria. Now, Queen Victoria, we've done what, 1, 2, 3, 4 Georges, so there's 2 more to go. Queen Victoria had a son. He became Edward the 7th. Let's get that right. He had a son, and here's the next George. He was George the 5th, and George the 5th had a son, and he became Edward the 8th. I'm just doing it in this direction to get it back on camera. There we go. Edward the 8th abdicated. Didn't last long, but he ended up going, and his brother Albert became king, but he became George the 6th. And then we have Elizabeth II. There we go. And I still find it hard to say and write Charles III. So there you go, there's all the Georges, and there could be another one because William has a son and he's called George. All the kings called Edward. It's a challenge. Just like the Henrys, you can separate the Edwards out into groups, so 1 to 3 and then the next 3 and then 2. But we have to go all the way back to 1239 when Edward's born to Henry III. Henry III was mad, obsessed with Edward the Confessor, so he called his son Edward, but you might know him better as Longshanks because he was really tall. Edward I was on his way north to have words with Robert the Bruce when he fell ill with dysentery and died. But it was okay because he had a son and he was called Edward, and he became Edward II. Now, Edward II caused a lot of problems. He didn't manage to fight off Robert the Bruce, and then he had a lot of favourites that annoyed everybody. It's a long story, but he was chucked off the throne. He may or may not have had a red-hot poker shoved up his rear end, but it was okay because he had a son, and he was called Edward. He's the one who people think about with knights and chivalry and all the rest. Now, Edward III had a son, and guess what he was called? Edward. Yeah, he was Edward of Woodstock because, well, he had long hair, was a bit of a hippie, liked music concerts. That's not really true. But he was later known as Edward the Black Prince, and he died before his father, so he never made it. But he had a son, And he was called Richard. And Richard II, well, he had a bit of a problematic reign as well, upset a few people. And he lost his throne to a chap called Henry. So we move into a group of Henrys. So what have we got? Henry IV, and then Henry V, and then Henry VI. They came down through John of Gaunt from Edward III. But we're back to the Edwards again, because another Edward comes along and throws Henry VI off his throne, and he becomes Edward IV. He also comes from Edward III through the House of York. There we go. Now, Edward IV had a son, and he was called Edward. He was Edward V, but he was one of the young princes in the Tower. So, well, we don't really include him. He went missing, and the throne went to his uncle, Richard. Now, we'll talk about this another time because it's a bit more complicated, but along comes Henry Tudor, and we've got another Henry. Henry has a son, and he's called Henry VIII. Let's spell it properly. Henry VIII has a son at last, and he's called, guess what? Edward. Yep, we've got another Edward, and he's Edward VI. But he dies really young, and he causes a lot of succession problems with Mary and Elizabeth. But we don't see any Edwards for a while. We've got Tudors, we've got Stuarts, we've got Hanoverians. So these are the Georges. We've got George 1 to 4. We've got William, we've got Victoria. And then back come the Edwards, because her son Bertie takes the throne as Edward VII. He has a son called George. He's George V. And he has a son called Edward. And he is our 8th Edward. And he abdicated in 1936, 700 years after. Where does Bonnie Prince Charlie fit in? Let's have a look. So we have to go all the way back to 1603 when Elizabeth I died and James Stuart, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England. Now he had a son and he was called Charles I. Charles I was the one who fell out with Parliament. It led to civil war and it led to him losing his head. For a while there was an interregnum and Oliver Cromwell was doing his thing, but it was a road to nowhere. But it was okay because Charles had a son and he was called Charles. Charles II restored the monarchy in, 1660. Now, Charles died without a legitimate heir, so the throne went to his brother, James II. Now, James did have children. He had a few boys, but they all died really young. The ones that made it to adulthood were Mary and Anne, with his first wife, Anne. They were Protestants and brought up Protestants, and then he married again, and he had a son called James, but this time he'd married a Catholic, and James was brought up Catholic. It's quite important in the story. And James II caused quite a few problems, mirroring his father. He fell out with Parliament, he was Catholic, he was too close to France. Either he was pushed or he ran away, but he wasn't welcome on the throne. And so he went, not good. Oh dear. He went into exile into Europe and took his son with him. And this was 1688, the Glorious Revolution. Mary II took the throne with her husband. She said, yeah, I'll do it, but I have to do it with my husband, who was also related to James II. This is William of Orange, King Billy. And he fought off the Jacobites who tried to bring James back to the throne. This was where the connection between those two came. Now, she died before him and left him on his own, but eventually William died and they didn't have an heir. So the throne went to her sister Anne. Anne had 17 pregnancies, but still she died without an heir. So what was going to happen next? Well, these guys weren't welcome, and so they had to find the nearest Protestant relative, and they had to go back all the way to James, and there was another great-grandchild of James VI, and he was called George. His mother was in the running for a while, Sophia, but she died a few months before. And George I, well, look, if the Jacobites weren't annoyed with this lot, they were super annoyed with this lot. They wanted their throne back. There was an uprising in 1715, which was put down. And, of course, these guys went on to have children. He had a son called George, who became George II, and he had a son called Charles. And this was Bonnie Prince Charlie. And Bonnie Prince Charlie came over, and he tried to get his throne back, and he had a big fight in 1746 at Culloden against the armies of George II. And it didn't end well at all for the Jacobites. They were really, really crushed after that. It feels like there were loads of Cromwells, but there were two significant ones. They were a century apart, but they were related. We're going to have a look at how. We're going to go all the way back to the 1530s when Henry VIII is on the throne. Now, Henry VIII has a chief minister called Thomas Cromwell, and this is our first Cromwell, really well known. This is a painting of him, and this is him in Wolf Hall. He was Henry VIII's chief minister until 1540. He was involved in everything that went on, and eventually it all went wrong. And he fell out with the king, and he had his head chopped off. That's an axe, by the way. So Thomas Cromwell had his head chopped off. But he had a sister, and she was called Catherine. And Catherine was married to a chap called Morgan Williams. They had a son, and he was called Richard. Now, Richard got on well with his uncle Thomas. He even worked for him. And when Cromwell was executed, Richard took on his name. There was a lot of wealth here as well to go after because he was involved in the dissolution of the monasteries, and a lot of wealth came his way because of that. So Richard used the name Cromwell. Now, Richard had a son, and he was called Henry. And he had a son, and he was called Robert. They were far better at mixing the names up, this lot, than the royals. And he had a son, and he was called Oliver. And this is the second Cromwell. The second Cromwell that we talk about. Now, over here, what was happening is that Henry died. He had a son, and he was called Edward. Edward died, and it went to his sister Mary, and then her sister Elizabeth, and then her cousin James, the sixth and first. And then the throne went to Charles I. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a landowner. He was a Land Rover? No, he was a landowner and a soldier and a politician. He fell out with Charles I. Yes, it's a bit of an understatement. But what happened was that Charles I ended up losing his head. That's another axe, by the way. Now, Oliver Cromwell served as Lord Protector for a decade. He died, but it was okay because he had a son and he was called Richard. Well, it wasn't okay, really, because Richard was a bit rubbish. And in the end, Charles I had a son, and he was Charles, and he restored the monarchy as Charles II when Richard wasn't really good enough. So there you go. Oliver Cromwell there, the Lord Protector for a decade, but he was related, distantly, to Thomas Cromwell, the Chief Minister, back in the 1530s.